So glad to see all of you. I think almost all of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Corey Madden. I'm the director of the museum. I've been here for 5 years, going on 5 years, which is kind of amazing. So I pretty much know everyone in town, or if I don't know them, half an hour after I've seen them, your friends know that you've seen me, because that's the way the town works. I'm thrilled that you're all here. I think that actually architects look particularly good in this space. There's just something about you all, designers. You look great. This is an amazing exhibit that Sydney is going to tell you a lot about tonight, but it does represent something that this museum is kind of, we have this extraordinary legacy of work that's we have responsibility for. And when we have somebody as amazing as Sydney, and we have a conversation, I'm sure she'll tell you about this, she goes so much further and more into a better place than the initial idea that I put in front of her. And she finds this incredible, kind of just treasure chest of very important images and a very important story about this region, which is this region's relationship to modernism. And this region's the photographers of this region's relationship to photographing modernism. And I think that that's what I hope that you'll really get from tonight, which is that this place, which is so well known for the F-64 movement and people like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and Wynne Bullock and on and on and on, and Morley Baer, that seems to be like where a lot of the reputational capital kind of goes, like, oh, there's so many photographers. But what you see here is this dialogue between photographers and architects. And we don't, and maybe should, and one of the things that Sydney found out was that this collection was given to us in part because there was a desire to create an architectural study center at the museum. And because there have been some turnover in directors over the years, some of those ideas get lost. So here we are at a moment again where we might get to ask that question again, which is what could the Monterey Museum of Art do for architects and designers in this region in the same way that we are committed to photographers and other kinds of artists. So I hope you'll keep that in mind. Your engagement with our museum is incredibly important. I want to thank Eric Dyer in particular for consistently saying yes to opportunities to engage with us, and also to Charmaine for organizing the event. And I'll just introduce Eric, who will, I think, introduce Sydney. Okay, thank you. Don't forget
Thank you, Corey. I'm Eric Dyer, architect and head of programs for the Arts and Architecture Lecture Series, as we call it, for AIA Monterey Bay. I'm really thankful for the opportunity for AIA Monterey Bay to partner with the Monterey Museum of Art, which is, I think this is their second in recent memory, and on presentations which express the rich relationship between the architecture and the other arts, in this case photography. With this in mind, I also wanted to make sure everyone puts Tuesday, April 22nd on their calendar, where we'll continue to delve into the relationship between architecture, photography, with a program featuring one of the great contemporary photographers out there today, Joe Fletcher, and speaking on his work. And then there'll be a panel of some of his architect's clients, moderated by Marianne Shikatans, who is here, and they'll discuss how they work together. And that will be at La Mirada, again, Tuesday, April 22nd. It's really exciting for the museum to focus in this exhibition on the great photographer Morley Baer, who was so connected to our area and to this area's architectural community. As the title of the exhibit alludes to, he was the major photographer documentarian of the Northern California modernism of the second half of the 20th century, from the second Bay Area tradition and architects like Worcester and Henry Hill to the third tradition with MLTW and Sea Ranch, not to mention, of course, people like Mark Mills of the organic tradition. And then I have to also add, there's many architects from our area, from our community, people like Don Goodhue and David Martin, who's also here, who had a building photographed by Morley. We have the perfect speaker today, as she was the curator of this exhibit and has a rich history presenting and exhibiting art and architecture. We're very lucky to have Sydney Payton as a fairly new member of our community as well. She holds a master's in curatorial practice from the California College of Arts with an emphasis on architectural history and theory. She has been a gallerist in Denver, Colorado. She went on to become the director and chief curator of the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, and then took over the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver, where she oversaw the design construction of their new building designed by the British Ghanaian architect Sir David Adjaye. It's a really wonderful building in Denver. If you've never been to it, I'd recommend it. She has curated over 50 exhibitions for major artists, and in 2022 founded, I got to get the pronunciation right, Mazzi Press. Mazzi Press, as a book arts space for collaborations between writers and artists, where she serves as publisher, curator, editor, or contributor. And she has done such amazing research and study of Morley Baer to put on this wonderful show. I'm very excited to hear all her insights. So please help me welcome Sydney.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, friends, olds and soon to be, I hope, and old by just being here a few years. But I do feel like I know this community and have fallen in love with it. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the AIA Monterey Bay Board and members for this opportunity to speak with you about Morley Baer. Charmaine, thank you so much for pulling us all together, and Mike and Paul back there on the audio video, and of course we're here at the Monterey Art Museum, and I'd like to acknowledge the director, Corey Madden, who you just heard from, and her fantastic team here. And especially, I would like to draw attention to Eleanor Uhlinger, who is the fantastic archivist, and she has pulled some materials here, which you see behind me, and they speak to this little treasured archive. I notice there's a lot of collective wisdom in this room, and as you know, I'm new to the area, so I see that it is a presentation and discussion. So I hope that you'll feel free to jump in with anecdotes, or maybe at the end we'll have Eric and I will have a little bit of a Q&A, because I assume that many of you know much more than I do, certainly about Morley Baer and also about architecture in Northern California. So I'm sitting talking to you about a subject for which you are well versed, and I hope to offer you some additional insights about the work, but also just about photography in general. And so my thoughts are that I'm going to talk a little bit about Morley, I'm going to talk a little bit about photography in general, and I'm going to talk about the role of publications, especially during this period that Morley is, that we're representing here, which is post-war, the late 40s into the 60s, and the role of publications and putting out the image of what has become California photography and California architecture. And together we'll take a little look at some of Morley's images writ large here that are in the exhibition, and I'll talk a little bit about them specifically. On occasion, we'll just look together. And then lastly, I want to talk about the archive. So the first thing I want to address is a concern that's come forward about the exhibition, which is that the didactics do not mention the architects. So there's two things that have happened. One is that the museum has put together this guide for you all, which is basically the checklist for the exhibition. It does name each architect, but there is kind of a reason behind the architects' names not being associated with the work, and that is that the exhibition is about Morley Baer. It happens to be that the subject is singular, and that's architecture. In general, when you have a singular subject, it's a thematic exhibition, so you have a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different artists participating. But in this particular case, we're getting a singular viewpoint of architecture, and that's Morley's. So it was a conscious choice because I wanted to make sure that we were drawn to this broader subject than to the specifics of the content. But now we're here to talk about the content specifically. And thank you all for bearing with us while we got this guide together. I think it'll be helpful, and people will really enjoy knowing who did what image, who did what work of architecture. So we want to go with, here are the architects that are represented. And you know many of them, and some of them are quite well known, and others maybe a little bit more obscure. But I wanted you to see a master list of, you know, the subject here and how many people are represented. Now, this is in no way a comprehensive list of all of the architects who are creating work at this time frame post-war in Northern California, but I think it's a pretty healthy representation. And it just happens to be that our main guy here had a relationship with all of these people. So who is Morley Baer? Now, there's a didactic on the wall that tells you a little bit about him, but I would like to say, why are his photographs, once considered to be commercial documents, now being exhibited in the context of fine art? So this is a question that I'd like you to carry through as we move forward. He was born in during World War I in Toledo, Ohio, and at the time that was a $9 train ride from Toledo to Chicago. That's about 4 hours. He has an MA in theater, and I think that this is an important piece of the Morley story, because theater is a storytelling device. It has narrative structure. It's about setting something in a time and a place. It's performative, but it's also contingent. It's atmospheric, it's transporting, and it's about creating imaginary worlds. And I think that we think of these works as actual documents, but I think they're also about imaginary worlds. Morley won the Prix de Rome in 1980 for being the foremost architectural photographer in the world, as Eric mentioned. His work was featured in architectural and shelter magazines throughout his career, beginning in the 40s. So here's a picture of Morley and Frances Baer. Frances, and this is from a book of Morley's called Remembering Barns. There are many books on Morley. Most of them address his landscape work, his coastal images, and images of barns. There are no books about this body of work. This is the first exhibition ever to be made of his architectural photographs, and I'm quite proud of the discovery, to be honest. This photograph it's attributed to Baer, but with an assist by Edward Weston. And here we see Frances and Morley kind of in a moment of love. They met at a clam bake in Virginia Beach in 1945, and they married kind of quickly. They married in 1946. And their move to California was in part driven by their interest in Weston, at least Morley's interest in Weston. They came here and set up a portrait studio in Carmel, and I'm curious about if anybody in the room ever had Morley take their portrait. Morley worked with a 8x10 Ansco camera, which he bought from Weston for $35. And he also had a 4x5 Hasselblad, but it was only used about 5% of the time, according to his son, Joshua Baer. So he really preferred this other camera that he got from Weston. Francis and Morley had a very tumultuous relationship. They were kind of on again, off again. They were married, and then they were separated for almost 10-year period, 8-year period. And during that separation, which was in the 70s, Morley made the work that he's known for now. So somehow, being away from Francis, he turned the lens more to his mentor and began taking photographs of coastlines, which I found to be interesting. Francis is missing from the story about Morley, and I tried very, very hard to include her and to find, in my research, to find evidence she was a photographer herself, and they had crazy agreements. Supposedly they had a written contract where when they were driving down the road, whoever saw something, if it was on their side of the car, they could photograph it. If it was on the other person's side of the car, these are like urban legends probably, but I think it was probably true because they did separate for quite a period of time. I'm sorry? They were competing with each other. I think that's true, and thus someone won and Frances got left out. But we'll hope to bring her forward in this conversation a little bit. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my curatorial process. Corey mentioned a little bit about that, but I received an invitation from Corey to put together a show about architecture. So I did what I do, which is I did all this research and I presented her with this idea about architecture of place. And one of the artists that was represented on this list was Morley. I didn't know that much about him, but I knew he took these pictures of adobes. And when in thinking about place, I was thinking about the vernacular architecture that is all around us. And so I talked to Corey about it, and she was like, okay, that's a great idea, Sydney. That's a big, big idea. And this is part of my history as a curator, is I have these big ideas, but the spaces are always much smaller than my ideas. So she said, we have a Morley Baer archive. Would you be interested in looking at it? And at first I was like, oh no, I want to do this other show that featured like crazy people from all over the place. And but I said, of course, because I'm always forever curious. And this is the role of the curator, is to be continually curious, as it is the role of the artist and the poet. So I went down into the archives, and the archives look something like what's behind me here. These are boxes. There are 5 total gray boxes. Doesn't look like much, right? But there are 1,000 photographs in these boxes. And as Corey also mentioned, they were given with the intent to start an architectural archive here at the museum. And that promise has not been fulfilled, but it is in writing with Morley. His contract, when he gave the gift, says so. So maybe someday it will be fulfilled. Yeah, so here they were, all these wonderful things waiting to be discovered. And what I found is just one story. And there are many, many stories waiting to be told. For example, I just discovered a box last week, and it has a whole image of the influence of Japanese culture and aesthetics on California, Northern California architecture. So the idea turned into something else, and I'm very happy it did, because I like telling untold stories. And throughout my career, I've often shown work of artists way before they become famous, and I have a tendency to just kind of fall in love early before there's a wave of interest. I do hope that there will be a book at some moment representing this body of work. And this is just an image that I'm sharing with you from one of my first drafts. I'm working at this moment a little bit like Alfred Barr worked at, when he was running the early Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is I put a lot of images down and I look at them and I study them. And this is how I've worked throughout my career and sometimes it's just photocopies, but my selection process kind of starts with this more abstracted thing and then moving things around. So I wanted to mention to you that there are 4 types of photography as far as I'm thinking about it right now. This could change. Remember, I always like to remain curious. This photograph is an anonymous photograph. It's of the Barcelona Pavilion, and it was taken in 1929. And it's of course, this wonderful Mies van der Rohe building that we all love. And this is from the opening. And I consider this photograph to be a document. So this photograph kind of sits in a space of documentation, much like what Morley's work has set in for generations. People thought of this work, of these beautiful images that you're seeing around you, more as documents than as fine art. Then this image is of a photo souvenir, it's called. And the photo souvenir is an idea that comes forward from the conceptualist Daniel Burin. And he's talking about the authorship of work that's created in situ. So work that's created in situ and then has a photograph taken of it by Louise Lawler, who happens to be a very famous photographer. He did not consider to be Louise's work to be a photograph. He considered it to be a photo souvenir, a souvenir of an event, but not an actual document of the event, and also not a complete representation of an event. So there's also the photo souvenir. And that can kind of sit in 2 spaces. It can be a historical representation of events and experiences and occurrences that later in history maybe perhaps can be assessed as something else. Like in my estimation, Louise's photographs taken at the time of Burin's work in situ are now fine art objects. He would argue that. He's still alive, so that'll be for another day, but I believe that. Then we have the selfie. Everybody's familiar with that. This is a selfie about how to take a selfie like a male model. I think they nailed it. And these are the ubiquitous images that we see everywhere. They do have some aesthetic value, but they're not the same as a piece of fine art. They're also not a document, really. They're kind of a different, they sit in a different thing. And this is a beautiful fine art photograph, and this is by Thomas Struth. It's taken at the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's based on a Gustav Bott painting called Paris Street in 1877. And this image is a very meta image. It has a lot going on. It is a fine art photograph, but what we're looking at is also an image of a painting of that's the main event here, and we're looking at people looking. So it has a lot to say about the program of, it basically codifies the architectural program of these kind of white cube spaces which arrived at the beginning of the 20th century. So this image is of the Catherine Kuhn Gallery. And Catherine Kuhn was a very famous dealer in Chicago. And this picture was taken in 1937. And we're not looking at it because we're looking at what kind of photo it is. We're just looking at a picture of Catherine's gallery. And, you know, Chicago is sometimes called the city that birthed modernism. And we, of course, know everyone in this room knows this story, but a very exciting city for architecture. But it was still in 1936 learning how to embrace modern art. And so Catherine opens her gallery in 1936, and there was this committee that went around and harassed people and threw rocks through her window. But there's 2 stories of how Morley falls in love with Edward Weston, and they both involve this gallery. One is that he was sitting upstairs somewhere drinking tea, and he saw an Edward Weston photograph in the window. And the other is that he is actually inside the gallery, seeing the work. So what would an Edward Weston photograph in 1939 look like? Would look like this. Incredibly exciting, right? And hard to imagine that people were fighting against this as a classification of fine art photography still. Very, very beautiful. So it could have been this image, or it could have been this image. This is Edward Weston, 1939, nude floating. And while these Weston images struck Baer, it wouldn't be until the 1970s that he would align himself more directly with Weston, and by extension, the Adams legacy, I would say. And until this exhibition of architectural photography, Morley's main body of work that was recognized was this, his work that was more connected to Weston. And where the Weston images, were they considered fine art, as I stated in 1939? Certainly thinking of the forward Kuhn Gallery, you would say, yes, that she understood that. She went on to be the curator at the Art Institute for about 40 years, so quite an influential curator. But the art world was very slow to respond to this idea. And it wouldn't be until the 70s really that the American art world would take notice. And a lot of this has to do with the art market. You know, if things don't have auction value, they don't have value in a certain way. And photography was often thought to be a lesser medium because of its reproducibility and its association with being machine-made rather than human-constructed. Like, look at how far we've come, quite a ways from that. And it wasn't until 1924 that the Boston Museum of Fine Arts started to collect photography. And they were the first museum to do so. So they're kind of way behind the curve. In America, we were way behind the curve on photography in general. And then we end up in conceptualism in the 70s and artists like Cindy Sherman and the pictures generation. And then photography starts to really take off as an art form. And so I wanted to just read you briefly this quote of Morley's about his thoughts about the relationship between photography and art or fine art. The so-called schism between commercial photography and art is of no great significance today. And he's saying this in 1981. And this is from a really special publication I found in my research called Archetype. And it only came out for about a few years, but it was at this super high level where there was a lot of theoretical discussion about architecture in the Bay Area. Each spills over on the other depending on whose intelligence runs the camera. So he is making an ego statement about himself here. I am less able today to define exactly where the boundaries are, and I no longer find it necessary. Occasionally I can look at a building and feel so moved by a part of it that I almost automatically respond with an abstracted detail. But the main job continues to be one of understanding and to characterize a building in terms of its spirit and substance, and to do so with insight and clarity. And I think he achieved that. So as I mentioned, there's a big role that architectural magazines played in just the whole evolution of architectural photography. And on the left, we have Architectural Record, and as many of you know, this is the world's oldest publication of architecture. It was founded by Clinton Sweet in 1893. Kind of wild to think of such a long time ago. And it was founded because there was an alignment with the Great Fire, and then also, again, back to Chicago, the World's Fair, and there was a big imprint left by the 1893 World's Fair and Burnham and Olmsted's work, and the city was just on fire, and there was a lot of interest. So the idea was to create this professional tool. And this is a quote from architectural record. It was the media that framed it, operationalized it, and conditioned architecture. And I don't know if you architects agree with that, but it's probably true, right? It was also responsible for the transformation of architectural composition into architectural design. It used to be called, your field used to be called architectural composition, and then it became architectural design. And I would argue it also framed architectural thinking. From 1930 to 1965 in California, the fields of design, craft, art, and architecture and landscape were radically moving away from the old modernist ideology and into new directions. Architecture in Northern California was quickly evolving with the work of Bernard Maybach, William Worcester, Charles Moore, all these names you are familiar with, and that's when it becomes coined this Bay Area region or Bay Area style by Lewis Mumford. So on the right, you have an image of a catalog from a MoMA show. Grace Morley, not related to Morley Baer, but Grace Morley founded MoMA in 1935, right? And lots of cool things happened in the beginning, including the presentation of Guernica, which I find to be unbelievable. But 3 important exhibitions looked to architecture, and those were in 1938, 1941, and 1948. And so there's this series of architectural presentations, let's call them. Wouldn't call them exhibitions, but we'll say exhibitions. Grace was very involved with Worcester, Moore, and Ernest Bourne. These guys were like chattering to each other all the time, and they were very involved in the creation of these exhibitions. Ernest Bourne would be the designer or the curator of the show, and his wife, Esther, would have taken many of the photographs. So the domestic architecture of San Francisco's Bay region would be argued in the pages of architectural record by architects not wanting to style label. However, Bay region architecture, as coined by Mumford, was seen as an attack on international style. Architectural photographs in support of the Bay Area region idea would appear in this September 1949 issue. I apologize for these. You wouldn't believe how long I looked for these images, even in the AR archives, to find the cover of the one on the left. It was impossible. They have the issue, but they've ripped the cover off. So anyway, these aren't the best quality images, I recognize, but they do give you an idea. And this was for the article that appeared in AR. This is what the person wrote. There is about the residential architecture of the Bay Area a quality which has long been made remarkable to the architectural profession and which has more recently been noticeable to laymen. That's how they used to talk. So here we have, we're present in the show now. You guys are like, when is she coming to the show? So here we are. This is John Konigshofer, and if I could be corrected on that pronunciation. This is a Baer photograph from 1947. Now remember, domestic architecture in the Bay Area was in 1949, this big hullabaloo, and Baer had just arrived in the area in 1947. And so while this particular image was not featured in the catalog that I showed you a picture of, it was featured later in other publications. And it was the very first, I believe, the very first representation of Baer's work in kind of his outing to the architectural community. And on this project, I also found out that Thomas Church was the landscape architect, which I found to be interesting. You know, this was meant to be a temporary structure. There was going to be another house. This was going to be the guest house ultimately. But such a fabulous building. So then we have Morley. Here's how it started to roll out after that. People took notice of Morley. They loved working with him. He was super charming, it seems like. I never met him, but I can tell just by the fact that many of these names that I brought up earlier, they worked with him over and over and over again. So yes, he was taking images for them for their portfolio projects, right, so that they could show their work to clients. But what kind of client is going to look at the image on the left here and go, oh, that's my house, right? So he was evoking something also through his own eye, his own artistic judgment, and his own sensitivity to the subject, but also to the site and specifically to the light. And then we have the image on the right, which is of the Frank Lloyd Wright Hannah House, which is at Stanford, and that image was on the cover of House Beautiful. So while Morley is, we're now seeing, set the tone with a singular voice for Northern California, who set the tone for what everybody thinks of as California architecture? That man was Julius Schulman, and he put out an image in the world of what is California architecture and was California architecture that still stands today. There was a ubiquity to his work, and he was also quite a businessman. From, as in all of the records that I looked at, some of the early AR magazines, for example, there were just images taken by various photographers, no authorship whatsoever. Julius was the first one to put his stamp on his work, and he did that to great success. He took mostly images of Southern California and things that you recognize more related to international style architecture that's so dominant there. But I have not found yet, and I will say that this whole thing is such a research project that there's so much more to learn, but I have not found an image of Schulman's that was taken above Santa Barbara. So, and Schulman worked all over the country too. He wasn't just working here, where Morley had this very discrete focus. And I think it's what makes his work so special. I mean, Schulman's work looked showy, I think, and he worked a lot in color, as you can see here. But Morley's work took on a different quality, and perhaps in rethinking what happened here in Northern California, maybe has more long-term value to the story of California architecture than it's been given credit. And so I wanted to present you, these two images are in the show, I know, but part of considering architecture is thinking about the unbuilt futures of a building, but also the unbuilding of futures, I like to say. So the building by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill of Monterey Savings and Loan, which is very familiar to everybody. Here, Morley has put in an unbelievable situation. It's in dialogue, right? So we have the historic and the modern in dialogue with each other. And he does this beautiful thing that he does with a lot of images as he creates this triangular space and a corridor. And we have these the very sensitive landscape of just the trees. And this is how it was supposed to look in perpetuity, as we all wish when we're creating things that they last this way in perpetuity. But this was the front of it. And I think I don't know who did this landscape architecture, but wouldn't it be cool if it was still there? So when I talk about lost futures, this is one of our lost futures here in our own community. And certainly seeing those trees would have created a wonderful civic experiential space and a social space and a condition that area of town much needs today. That's my own critique. This is the beautiful photograph that you see when you come in, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about this image, and it's 2 iterations by Morley. So this is 1, and this is 2. This one was an award-winning image. It's not the same building, but it's related, for the best exterior photograph, all from the Naval Postgraduate School. And Morley worked with Walter Nietzsche many, many times. And Walter has a theory called field theory, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And that goes something like this. The objective was for the process itself to release the potential for each field to will its emergence. And while we can't see that directly in Morley's work, I do think that there was probably some influence of Nietzsche to, or some translation of that into Morley's own way that he saw through the lens. Just a pause here on this gorgeous John Campbell building, right? So this is the closest one to the Schulman aesthetic in the show. It has that dynamism that Schulman has, even though it's black and white, but it also does this incredibly special thing, which it presents the best of Morley's ability to work or paint with light. Thomas Church, the Donnell Ranch Garden, which some of you are very familiar with, and I learned from Bernard here that Halpern, who is often co-credited on the creation of this, but he was just a young 20-something-year-old person working in the office. He's known for his simplistic design approach. Thomas Church and Lawrence Halpern are noted as designing the first kidney-shaped pool, so this is an important image. It's also been reproduced many, many times and inspired landscape architects in our own community. And I did want to mention that Church collaborated with Adeline Kent, who is an American sculptor, known for these abstract forms to create the sculpture which is looks like a Henry Moore. Beautiful Lawrence Halpern Garden, the Gould Garden. And I just wanted us to look at this together for the shapes, and also just look at how desirable it is. Lawrence had a fantastic restrained approach, and I think Morley really captures it. And then I wanted to take you through 4 images of one thing, so just to show you some of Morley's process. So this is the building, the skyscraper that is made very small over there. Some of these images I tried to make, I tried to negotiate with Joshua to make them bigger, and he agreed to do that. That was one that I wanted to make larger, but in the end I decided it's large even in its intimacy. So this is how Morley would snap the thing, and he would then go back into the studio. As you recall, a photograph is shot, but it's made in the darkroom. And here is Morley's process to show you that. This is the wonderful, kind of brilliant color version that shows us a lot about what's happening in downtown San Francisco. And in this Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill image, I wanted to draw your attention to the placement of the typewriter and the placement of the white pads on the desk. Now, I think these seem like very minor things, but to me, they're the handiwork of Morley Baer. And the composition rides completely on that white piece of paper that's on the farthest reach of the image, and it is the balancing tool for the rest of the photograph, and you can see this is really where Morley was a master in the dark room. The light and dark of the space, the bringing up the horse and making it probably darker than it was in real life, and then adding that light as we look back through the corridor. This is my favorite image in the show, and so I just have to show it. I think it's comic, and it has a lot of personality. It's Ernest Bourne's house, Ernest and Esther's. It's a little confusing, the date of this photograph, because there was a remodel on this house. So it says 1970, but I think it's an earlier photograph. So that needs further research, and as I said, there's just layers and layers of research, and I wanted to share my favorite image. Lawrence Halprin, his drawing for Sea Ranch, and I think that this really informed what happened and how Sea Ranch was built. It was part of the Bay Area region ethos as ecological, social, and political. And Morley was right there. He took the iconic image before it was built out. And again, you can see his handiwork with specifically the use of pushing things back and making them darker. William Turnbull, and again, another Hannah house, if you can, they're both called Hannah houses, at the Sea Ranch condominiums. And then lastly, this is Morley and Frances were architecture collectors. They lived in a Schindler house in Berkeley, and then they commissioned Wooster to do his last commission, and this is down at Garapata. And Frances didn't like the house, and that was part of the reason why they were estranged for a while, I think, is because she didn't like living at Garapata, but the house is beautiful. And Frances's handiwork is straight up on view here. That window is full of things that Frances would have liked to have seen in her daily life, but it's also a composition, and it relates back to the publications, the home magazines that were so predominant at the turn of the century. The reason we have an encompassing perspective of what was happening in architecture in Northern California post-war is largely due to Morley's visionary insistence on creating an archive. So what does an archive show us? And more so, what do Morley's photographs show us? How are we to understand their artistic nature? Morley was hired because he was an artist. The architects who he worked with wanted an artistic eye on their projects, while some argue that the overriding interest was in keeping a portfolio of work for clients to look at and for commissioning images that were publication worthy. The truth is that when we look at these photographs, neither of those ideas really hold. The photographs offer us an illusion of something, maybe a lifestyle akin to what Schulman was presenting in his Northern California images, but they are not selling us a particular aspect of a building. While some of the commission work does sell materials and construction and publications like those for the AIA Journal, Baer's photographs are more about art, more fiction than reality. And I think you don't read them that way at first, but if you look at them more closely, they're not really truth tellers. They're kind of giving you a sense of the space, of the captured view, and they're a black and white world of architecture that speaks to nature. The photograph was taken in situ, but made in the dark room, and that is where Morley built his images from a deep respect for the subject of architecture and for the architects he was working with. Morley's depiction of architecture is part glorification, part reference, an ode to the monumentality of creating black and white photography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was just wonderful. I had a lot of interesting things to talk about. Does anyone have a first question?
I'm in the anecdote department, not the question department.
I think there are many anecdotes in the room, so please do share.
My stepfather was on the list, and he always told me that he didn't think he would have been a success as an architect if he hadn't had Morley Baer photographing his projects.
Who was your stepfather?
Will Shaw, Bertie Shaw. So
That's a good anecdote.
yeah. Oh, also, that's also, he gave that to me as a piece of advice as an architect, is, don't mess around with cheap photography.
I think that goes without saying.
Right.
You get what you pay for, and that's true in all worlds. Yes.
He also said that Morley was really meticulous in that he would come, like when there was going to be a project, and if he was invited to do before pictures, he always came and did before pictures, and he kept really good records of them so that he could always, he envisioned the architecture, and he took the before picture, and then he could do the after picture if it was a remodel of a hotel or something. And really, he envisioned it before it happened with the architect. It was a real team
I think there was a
process.
dialogue. I think you're bringing up an interesting point, is that there was a lot more cross dialogue with the architects, and the photographs themselves were not only informing the architects, but they were informing other architects. So there was a little bit of a competition, that the way that these architects could view each other's work was through Morley. So in a way, he was instrumental in kind of creating a map between all these different people and their projects and their thinking about architecture. So, yeah.
Hi. First, Frances showed me a half dozen of her photographs. They were all 4x5, taken with the 4x5 camera. And they were mostly still lifes, taken very early on. But she was very proud of them. And I'm not sure, I think I've got a couple of them in storage someplace, but if I do dig them up, I'll make sure that they make their way to here.
I'd love to see them. I'm sure she never tread on
No, she was very careful.
on Morley's ground.
But you're right, she always was very proud of the fact that she staged every photograph that he took, as far as I could tell, at least when she was around.
This is research, so sometimes I'm throwing out theories that I'm not sure are correct. So thank you for validating my theory. Yeah, I really do. I do think she was very instrumental in the look of especially the interior shots.
Hi there. We were a few minutes late, so you might have covered this, but in the archive, what was the ratio of black and white to color?
No color, all black and white.
Right.
The one color image I showed that you did catch, they're kind of rare. I think that all of these, and you have to think about where they could have ended up, and they could have ended up in some publication, right? So at that time, they weren't doing a lot of color photography of architecture. You'll get to see that with this next lecture coming up, how far we've come as far as that is concerned. But I think Morley wasn't using color film very often.
Sydney, I wanted you to just fill in that story that you told about Morley making a master set, that this archive is not all his photographs, but talk about that.
So really, I have curated a show from Morley, who curated these photographs. There are over 1,000 of them. I believe I mentioned this, but I think they're like 1,040 or something. And Morley was a very conscientious artist, in that every single one of them on verso tells us about the image. The rest of it, he does have an archive at UCSC that is the more expansive archive, and it has ephemera in it too. This is exclusively an architectural archive. The one at in Santa Cruz also has other kinds of images, the coastal work in it as well, and letters. And so Morley kind of pre-curated this group of photographs. And I wanted, if you have a moment after this is over, if you want to come up, and Eleanor is still here with us or not, but yes, she is. She could show you this box that I just discovered last week that had this wonderful body of work that was, could be a whole other show about the Japanese influence on architecture. Is that, Corey, did I nail it? Okay, good. Yes, sir.
1 second, Don.
Two questions. One, with Garrapatta Beach being kind of the muse for Brett Weston, were they close? And
Brett or
yeah, Brett. Yeah.
I think that all the Westons were connected to the Baers, and I know Joshua Baer, Morley and Francis's son, is still alive. He lives in Santa Fe, and yeah, they all knew each other, and they were friendly. Frances worked for Edward Weston for a while. I'm not sure exactly what she did. And does anybody have information on this? Yes. Oh, well, Frances cleaned Edward Weston's house. Oh, well, there you go. I think Morley was quite the businessman. I have, my attraction to him is as an artist, but he also, he was quite a businessman. He was always making deals. He was getting paid for his work. They were able to afford these wonderful properties like Garrapatta and commissioning Worcester and a Schindler house, and so he was a hustler. And I think it wasn't until they had kind of grounded themselves and he was alone that he really came to the work that is more aligned with Weston and Adams.
So the other question I had was about his teaching and the mentorship that he did through the house there, the Worcester house there at Garrapatta. Do you know much about that?
I do know that Morley gave a lot of workshops. He taught at SFAI and was the head of the department there. I did find some notes in their archive about just the pedagogy that he was presenting. He occasionally did workshops with Adams, and I don't really have a good record of those. Every single one of the challenges, and this is not an excuse, it's just a challenge and an active curiosity, let's say, is every single one of these architects has their own archive, I hope. Some of them don't, but that would mean me going in and looking at other people's archives to really know the answers to all the questions. It's a phenomenal amount of research that could take place just from looking at one person's contribution.
Speaking of art direction, I know that, with my own work getting photographed, I have an opinion about views or vantage points or details or whatever. I'm just curious, do you know, maybe even over the evolution of his work, was there just imminent trust for him to come in and do what he does best, or is there?
I think ultimately yes. I don't know. Again, I don't know that. We will never know the answer to that, to be honest with you. But I think ultimately, absolutely, there was trust because he's working with these people over and over again. But I think what set the stage for that trust was that John Hoffing, how do you say it? Koenigshofer. Thank you. Koenigshofer image, the group of 9 photographs over there that appeared in that show in 1949 because it invited him into the conversation. And because he was invited in by Ernest Bourne and, Worcester and Moore were all there approving of him, that kind of launched him in a certain way. But he was very proud of his relationship with architects and his ability to stay true to their vision in a way, even though imposing his own, I believe. And that publication I mentioned earlier called Archetype that came out of San Francisco has a fabulous interview with him that kind of talks about that. And some of those quotes from that interview I've put on the labels. They're little wonderful quotes. He was very pithy, too, I would say, witty guy.
And do you have any thoughts about the relationship between his landscape work and the architectural photography and how those interrelated? And I guess the other question I would have, did he always do those simultaneously? Or
no, he didn't
was there...
start doing the landscape work till the 70s. Okay. And I think that the relationship was that he had been out on all these gorgeous sites, and he had been studying landscape, and he had this, you know, vision of himself in the lineage of Weston, really, but he had to make a living, so he made a living for a long time, and then when he had space, he went there. But I do think that the work, any of the buildings that are presented in the landscape, you know, are about site, I think he has a real reverence for site. So that magical thing that he had that became more realized later in his work, I think it was always present. And they were all black and white too, so you could break down just the objectness of it and the familiarity between the objects, whether, you know, organic abstraction of Mark Mills can look like, you know, stones and cliffs.
And are any of those publications still in print? I bet not, but I don't know.
There are a lot of books on Baer, and many of them are up here. Yeah. So I don't know if they're still in publication. Eleanor, question, are they in publication? Yeah, I think you can get them on, you know, I bought a lot of books. This was part of my research back here, and then there's a huge other part at home. I still use books. I did use the internet a lot because I was trying to find things like those 2 covers of the magazines, and which is not an easy thing to do. But I think you can find them, but not all of them.
Great. Any other questions? David?
You mentioned that he hadn't published any books of his architectural work. He did have, I've got 2 of his books, The Painted Ladies and The Adobe's in the Sun, I think.
Well, I guess I'm sorry. I needed to be clearer about that. I mean, the modernist work. Yes, you're right. There is a book, and The Painted Ladies were quite regarded, that body of work. And Adobe's in the Sun, also a beloved publication. But my research was specifically to look at the influence of modernism. Sure. And I think that, in a way, I would say, even with this box that I just found and love and has all this new stuff to think about, it's all through a modern perspective.
Okay. I know he taught some classes, I think from MPC. I took a class from Morley back in the 70s, and he was a wonderful teacher. I think, I don't know how many classes he taught locally here, but there were Henry Gilpin.
Well, he was the head of the art department at SFAI, so he probably was a good teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was a very exacting teacher when it came to showing your work. So I showed some photos that I'd taken years before that I was quite proud of, actually, black and whites in Italy, my first trip to Italy. But he was very critical of the technical ability. I think I was probably looking, he's an 8x10. I'm probably using a Brownie Hawkeye or something.
Those can take beautiful pictures too.
Yeah. Anyway, he was a great guy. He was just a wonderful guy to work and learn from.
And since I have you here, do you have any memories of that one shoot he did on one of your projects and how he liked to work?
Morley was looking for a place to take his class for architecture, and I had just finished my first house here locally. I was still working for other firms, hadn't gone out on my own yet, so took Morley to a house that I'd done up in Woodside Estates off Lorelis Grade. And he was very complimentary of my architecture, but not of my photography.
Anyone else have any questions? Oh.
mentioned this, but I'm curious about the type of camera. Speaking of camera.
Yeah, he
type.
used a Ansco camera, and he did have a 4x5 too, but he only used it 5% of the time, according to his son, who does know an incredible amount. And there is a good website on Morley, and he's on Instagram, and I have to say that the show has rocketed interest in Morley Baer on a national level, which is really cool.
And does his nephew still have basically control of the estate and
The son.
sales?
Yeah,
the son,
estate,
sorry,
the,
yeah.
son, the estates, and everything is done by permission from the estate, and it's exacting just like his father. The museum and Eleanor and the whole team here did such a fantastic job working with Joshua to get the rights to reproduce some of these images, because they're not all silver gelatin prints. Some of them were reproduced, and then they were reproduced. The ones, like the bigger ones especially, were done by Ryuji, who is a master photographer and was able to take these little 4x5s and make magic.
I just wanted to thank you for this. It's a real treat to be here in Monterey, something of this quality. Eric and team, Corey and team, it's just a real gift. And when do you think your book on Morley will be out?
Oh my gosh, I think that's about a 3 to 5 year project, to be honest. Do you see all the holes in my presentation? I mean, there's so many holes in this research, and just all the stories that you all have. I meet with Eleanor and she's like, well, did you see this? And I'm like, no, how did I miss that? I mean, the guilt is tremendous. So it would be a big project. Hopefully I'll be able to work on other shows that will offer other things. And maybe there would be a Morley Baer. There should be. Maybe I'm not sure I'm the scholar for that, but I would like to think I was, because I am passionate about it.